Hello, world history. This is Mr. Janosiak coming to you from my home. Today, we are going to talk about Central America and the Caribbean in the early 1900s. And I have one final note here about Latin America, and then we'll get into that Caribbean and Central America piece. Big takeaways is this idea that this region of the world, after it throws off European colonization, lots of military strongmen, lots of conflict in these regions, lots of revolutions in these regions, and then kind of a general trend of strongmen and dictators who are being supported by both the United States, most of the United States in this particular part of the world, Central America and the Caribbean, strongmen protected by the United States at the expense of people's freedoms to protect American business interests. Let's get into it, shall we? So, to wrap up, in 1929, the United States plunged into the Great Depression. It spread worldwide in the 1930s. The Great Depression had a strong impact on Latin America. Prices for the region's major exports, including sugar, bananas, copper, and oil, fell because of reduced demand. The elites, whose wealth came from the sale of these products, lost much of their wealth and power. In Brazil, for example, the Depression brought down the coffee elite, finally accomplishing what the middle class reformers could not. In much of Latin America, increased unemployment led to unrest. Instability followed, and progress toward democracy stalled. After military coups, army officials replaced civilian leaders in Argentina, Bolivia, and Peru. Even in those nations where civilian rule continued, government control increased. In Uruguay and Peru, governments cracked down on labor and peasant groups. This postponed further social reform. In Bolivia, Brazil, and Venezuela, undemocratic leaders moved forward with some reform, hoping to prevent unrest. The Depression also fostered economic independence in some countries. As earnings from exports declined, many nations could no longer afford to import manufactured goods. As a result, the region had to develop its own sources for these goods. Industry grew in many nations. Colombia, for example, became a major producer of cotton textiles. In Brazil, the government encouraged manufacturing. This quest for economic self sufficiency aroused economic nationalism in Latin America. The boldest expression of economic nationalism came when Bolivia and Mexico seized their nation's foreign owned oil companies. In the years between 1910 and 1945, life in Latin America had both radically changed and remained the same in many ways. In many places, life had changed very little. Paraguay, for example, remained almost totally rural and isolated. In Brazil, residents of the vast interior were barely affected by changes in the nation's fast growing industrial cities. At the same time, by the mid 20th century, more people in Latin America had been exposed to a basic public education. In cities, an industrial working class was growing. Changes in communication and transportation were drawing people together and linking them to the national and world economies. These trends would continue through the rest of the 20th century. The Mexican Revolution had little effect on Central America and the Caribbean. Most of the Caribbean islands remained French, Dutch, or British possessions. Only Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba gained independence before World War II. Like the nations of South America, their economies were based on the export of agricultural products and natural resources. Economic development was financed by foreign investment. U.S. investment built huge coffee and sugar plantations. By the 1920s, American owned companies in these nations were producing most of the world's sugar. Most of Central America followed a similar course. Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and El Salvador gained independence from Spain as part of Mexico in 1821. In 1823, they declared their independence from Mexico and formed the United Provinces of Central America. But the United Provinces did not stay together very long. Peasant revolts and conflicts between liberals and conservatives split the United Provinces into separate nations by 1840. I'm going to pause here because my cat won't stop meowing. Do, do, do. You hear me do, do, do. This habit is slow. And okay, weird pause, but I'm back, and my cat is gone. Forever, I hope. By the late 1870s, the liberals had gained control in all these nations but Nicaragua. Meanwhile, the United States and Britain competed over development rights. Coffee and banana plantations provided the major exports. They also promoted the rise of a land-owning liberal elite. In every country but Costa Rica, elites and foreign investors relied on dictators to provide stable government and protect their interests. Cuba. The Caribbean island of Cuba was home to many American-owned sugar plantations. In the 1890s, it revolted against Spanish rule. U.S. troops invaded Cuba in 1898 and forced Spain to grant its independence. To protect U.S. interests, troops remained in Cuba until 1902. They built roads and schools. They established economic and educational systems modeled after those in the United States, which is all well and good. But remember that these large plantations that made them a lot of money were not owned by Cuban people, they were owned by the United States. The United States pressured the Cubans to amend their new constitution to give them the right to oversee Cuban affairs. So imagine that. They tried to write a constitution for Cuba, but the U.S. demands to watch over and meddle in all of Cuban affairs. U.S. officials supervised the election of Cuba's first president. American rule returned between 1906 and 1908, following his resignation. U.S. troops occupied Cuba again from 1917 to 1923, when more political unrest threatened to disrupt the booming sugar economy. In 1933, the United States helped bring about the overthrow of a brutal dictator. Army Sergeant Fulgencio Batista seized power. Backed by U.S. business interests, Batista ruled Cuba for most of the next 25 years. Here's a picture of Batista. And again, remember, he is backed by the United States. They give him a lot of money, and he is kind and friendly, not necessarily to the Cuban people, but to the United States. This will cause future resentments, as we will see with the Cuban Revolution and the implementation of the Castro regime and communism.